I was in Birmingham, Alabama for work, staying at the Hyatt. It was one of those standard business trips I'd done 100 times before. Nothing about the hotel stood out. Clean lobby, neutral-colored hallways, the kind of place you could forget the second you left it. My room was on the 4th floor at the end of the hall, far from the elevators. I'd been there for a couple of days already in my usual routine: grab dinner, come back, shower, maybe watch some TV, then sleep. The first strange thing happened on my second night. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a scream. It wasn't just someone yelling. It was sharp, high, and raw, like something you'd hear in a movie right before the worst part happens. Cut through the quiet so suddenly that I froze in bed. My first thought was that someone was being attacked, but I didn't hear anything else. No running footsteps, no doors slamming, no voices, just silence. My heart was pounding, but after a minute or so, nothing more happened. I sat there, staring at the shadows on the wall, thinking maybe it was a dream. I've had vivid dreams before, the kind that leave you unsure when you wake up. After about 10 minutes of hearing nothing, I convinced myself it was just that. I lay back down and eventually fell asleep again. The next day was normal. I left early for work, didn't spend much time in the room until late at night. I didn't think much about the scream anymore. It was one of those things you mentally file away as nothing. But the following night, something else happened. I woke up around 3 in the morning, not because of a sound, but because of this heavy feeling, like the air in the room was thicker than it should be. It was warm, but not uncomfortably so, and I was lying on my side facing the wall. I had this sudden awareness that something was different. I rolled over, pulling the blanket closer, and that's when I saw him. There was an old man sitting on top of the boxed-in AC unit by the window. He wasn't looking at me. His head was turned slightly toward the wall, like he was lost in thought. He had this round, heavy build, maybe in his 60s, with the top of his head bald but a white ring of hair wrapping around it. A thick gray mustache covered his mouth, and his eyebrows were bushy, almost overgrown. He wore blue coveralls over a red checkered shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his forearms. One of his feet was resting on the ledge of the unit, the other hanging down slightly. His hand was holding a cigarette, and faint wisps of smoke curled in the air above him. I stared for several seconds, not breathing, trying to understand why someone was in my room. There was no sound except the faint hum of the AC beneath him. His head slowly turned toward me, and for a split second, our eyes met. My chest tightened instantly, adrenaline kicking in. I threw the blanket off and sat straight up, ready to run for the door, but there was nothing there. The AC unit was empty. The room looked exactly as it had when I'd gone to bed. Neatly folded curtains, nothing out of place. No smell of smoke. I stood there for a while, breathing hard. I wasn't dreaming. I knew what I saw. I'd been able to move, to sit up. I'd felt the blanket sliding off me. My pulse was still hammering in my ears. It didn't feel like one of those strange half-asleep moments. I've had those before, and this was different. I turned on the light and checked the lock on the door. It was still latched from the inside. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stood there staring at myself in the mirror. I kept trying to find some explanation. A shadow from the curtains, some leftover image from a dream I didn't remember, but I could recall every single detail about him, down to the rolled-up cuffs of his shirt. I ended up staying awake the rest of the night, sitting in the chair by the desk with the TV on low. The next morning, I felt drained. My head was heavy, and I couldn't focus during work. I almost wanted to check out and move to another hotel, but I had 4 more nights booked, and switching felt like too much trouble. I told myself it was some weird trick of my mind, maybe exhaustion, maybe something about the lighting. Still, when I went to bed that night, I kept the lights on. Nothing happened for the rest of the trip. No more screams. No more waking up to see anyone in the room. But there were odd little things I noticed. My suitcase felt slightly moved one morning, though I couldn't be sure. One night I thought I heard faint footsteps in the hallway around 3, but when I peeked out, it was empty. I didn't feel in danger exactly, but I didn't feel at ease either. On my last morning, I woke up before my alarm. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and my head felt foggy, like I'd overslept even though I hadn't. I realized I couldn't remember much about the trip. The days had blurred together in a strange way, almost like gaps in memory. I remembered my work meetings, the restaurants I ate at, but in this vague, distant way. It wasn't until I was packing up that I thought about something I'd read before: how carbon monoxide exposure can mess with your head, cause vivid hallucinations, memory loss, and headaches. I hadn't had a headache, but the thought made me pause. I checked the AC unit, the windows, the vents, even though I didn't know what I was looking for. The air felt normal. I considered mentioning it to the front desk, but didn't. I just left my key, rolled my bag to the car, and drove off. I've stayed in dozens of hotels since then, and nothing like that's happened again. But I still remember that man as clearly as if he were standing in front of me right now. The way his shoulders hunched slightly forward, the faint shadow his cigarette made against the wall, the way his eyes locked on mine for just that moment before he was gone. I don't know if it was a trick of my brain, something in the air, or something else entirely. All I know is I saw him, and he was as real to me in that moment as anything I've ever experienced. And even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that if I ever stayed in that exact same room again, I might see him sitting there, waiting. I had booked the motel in New York City because it was cheaper than the hotels around the area, and I figured I'd barely be in the room anyway. It was one of those older places with faded carpet in the hallways and that faint, stale smell that never quite leaves no matter how much cleaner they use. My room was small but fine enough at first glance. A single bed, a desk by the wall, a safe in the closet, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in at least 20 years. I'd stayed in worse. The first night was uneventful. I came in late, tossed my bag on the chair, put my spare room key on the desk, and went to bed. The key was one of those plastic cards, but I had asked for a spare in case I misplaced the first one. I didn't even use it. It just sat there on the desk with my phone charger and a bottle of water. The next morning, I noticed it wasn't there. I figured I must have knocked it off, so I checked the floor, under the bed, behind the desk. Nothing. I even pulled the chair out, looked inside the trash bin, checked my bag. I'm not careless with that sort of thing, so it bothered me more than it should have. I went through the same search 2 more times during the day, but it was just gone. It was strange, but I didn't want to make a big deal about it. The staff probably thought I lost it, and I didn't feel like arguing. I still had my main card, so I let it go. That evening, I went to open the safe in the closet to grab some cash. I kept my money and passport inside it so I wouldn't have to carry them around all day. The code I set was simple, nothing I could forget. I typed it in, but the screen flashed error. I tried again. Same thing. I took my time, pressing the buttons slowly, making sure I wasn't hitting the wrong ones. Still error. I stood there for a moment, feeling this wave of irritation. I knew I had the right code. I had used it earlier that morning. I tried a few more times until it locked me out for several minutes. When it finally let me try again, it still wouldn't work. I had to call the front desk and wait for someone to come up with a master key. The guy was polite enough, but it felt like he was watching me too closely, as if checking what I was keeping in there. I told myself I was overthinking it. Still, it stuck with me. The next day was long, and I got back late, probably around midnight. My key card didn't work in the door. I tried it several times, flipped it around, swiped it slower, swiped it faster. Nothing. I went down to the front desk, explained it, and they reprogrammed it. That worked, so I went up and let myself in. I slept fine that night. Nothing seemed out of place. The real problem came the following evening. I had been out most of the day, got back close to 11, and found the door wouldn't open again. I felt that same annoyance as before, but I figured I'd just go get it fixed. I went downstairs, got the card sorted, came back up, and slid it into the reader. The light turned green, but the door only opened about an inch before stopping dead. I pushed harder, thinking maybe the carpet was stuck or the frame had warped. Then I realized what it was. The latch inside was engaged. One of those metal swing latches that folds over to block the door. It wasn't one of the heavy ones you see in newer hotels, just a basic metal bar screwed into the frame. But it was closed all the way. I stepped back and just stared at it for a moment. I had been out all day. No one else had my key. I hadn't left the latch on. And it wasn't the kind that would just swing shut on its own. It had to be moved into place from the inside. I went back down, told the desk, and they sent a handyman up. He looked at the gap in the door, frowned, and started working at it with some tool to try and push the latch back. Took a while. The latch had a little give, but not enough to slide out of place without someone inside pushing it. Eventually, he got it loose, and the door swung open. The room looked exactly the same as I'd left it. My bag was still on the chair, my jacket on the bed. Nothing seemed moved. I checked the safe, the bathroom, the closet. Nothing missing, nothing added. The handyman said nothing and left. I sat on the bed for a long time trying to make sense of it. I replayed the day in my head, what time I'd left, when I'd last been in the room, how the latch could have possibly ended up like that. I'd been using that door for days. The latch was stiff. Even if a draft could move it, which it couldn't, it would take a solid push to set it in place. The only possibilities that made sense were ones I didn't want to think about. Either someone had been in the room after I left and locked it from inside before leaving some other way, or there was another access point I hadn't noticed. But the windows didn't open more than a few inches, and I was several floors up. I barely slept that night. I kept the lights on and lay there listening for any sound from the hallway or inside the room. Every creak from the walls made me tense. The next morning, I packed up early. I checked every pocket of my bag for that missing spare key one more time before leaving. It wasn't there. I handed my main key in at the desk without saying much. The clerk smiled, but I didn't smile back. On the train out of the city, I kept running it through my mind. The missing spare key. The safe that suddenly stopped accepting my code. The latch locked from the inside when no one should have been there. Each thing could have been an inconvenience on its own, but together they painted a picture I didn't like. I realized that from the first night, someone could have had access to my room without me knowing. Maybe they didn't take anything because they weren't after my belongings. Maybe they just wanted to see what they could do without me noticing. And the thought that I wouldn't have known if they had been inside while I was sleeping, that's what stayed with me the most. Even now, I don't know what happened in that room, but I know I won't stay in a place like that again. This happened to my father years ago, but it's one of those stories that has stayed with me because of how strange and unsettling it is. It wasn't some ghost story, and it didn't have jump scares or anything like that. The creepiness came from how real it felt, how there was no clear explanation, and how much it still bothered him even long after it happened. He had gone on a trip to Tanzania with a group of people to do medical work in a small, poor village. They were there to help with basic healthcare, vaccinations, wound treatment, checkups. It was the kind of trip where they worked all day in hot weather, often in places with no air conditioning, just the smell of dust and sweat all around. For the first part of the trip, they stayed in the village itself, sleeping on thin mats or basic cots, but for a few nights they moved to a small hotel in a nearby town. It wasn't anything fancy. Concrete walls, tile floors, thin mattresses, and a bathroom with a shaky door that didn't always close all the way. My dad was sharing a room with another man from the group. They had separate single beds with maybe 2 feet of space between them. On the first night there, my dad was sleeping deeply, exhausted from the day. At some point in the night, he woke up. The lights were on, and his roommate was sitting up in bed. His posture was stiff, hands clutched together like he was bracing himself. My dad noticed his breathing was uneven, almost like he had just run. The man didn't say anything, and my dad didn't press him. It was the middle of the night, and he assumed maybe he'd had a bad dream. My dad turned over and went back to sleep, but he remembered how pale his roommate looked. The man stayed sitting up for a while before eventually lying down again. The next day passed without incident. They worked in the town, tending to people, moving supplies, and dealing with the chaos that always comes with group travel in another country. That night, my dad was tired enough that he thought nothing would wake him. But sometime in the middle of the night, nature called. The room was almost completely dark except for the faint orange glow coming in through the thin curtains from the streetlights outside. He got up quietly so he wouldn't disturb his roommate. The tile floor felt cold under his bare feet as he made his way to the bathroom. He pushed the bathroom door open and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of soap and the dampness of the shower area. But then, underneath that, he caught something else. A strong, raw scent of body odor. Not just sweat, but that heavy, unwashed smell that sticks in the air. It was sharp enough to make his stomach twist. He froze. Almost everyone in their group came from the US, and they used deodorant daily. The smell didn't belong to anyone in the room, and the door to the hallway had been locked from the inside before they went to sleep. He turned his head slowly toward the doorway. A woman was standing there. She wasn't moving, just standing in the frame of the bathroom door. Her body was trembling in short, sharp shudders, like she was shivering but faster. Her eyes were rolled upward so only the whites were showing, and her head was tilted slightly back, locked toward the ceiling. She was wearing a loose, faded dress that hung unevenly on her. He stared at her for what couldn't have been more than a second or two, but in that moment, his brain scrambled to make sense of it. How had she gotten into the room? The door was locked. The windows had bars. She wasn't holding anything, wasn't saying anything, just shaking. Instinct took over, and he spun back toward the toilet, not knowing what to do, thinking maybe to step back or grab something. When he looked back to the doorway, she was gone. There was no sound of footsteps, no sound of a door, just the empty frame of the door leading back into the room. He stood there for a few moments, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it was in his throat. Eventually, he forced himself to move. He stepped back into the room and looked around. Nothing. His roommate was still asleep, facing the wall. My dad told himself maybe he'd been dreaming, maybe half asleep and imagining it. The exhaustion from the workdays and the heat could make the mind do strange things. He lay back down, pulling the thin sheet over himself even though it was warm. His ears strained for any sound. After a while, as the adrenaline slowly drained out of him, he began to relax again. His breathing slowed, his eyelids grew heavy, and then, faintly, the smell came back. It was the same sharp scent of sweat and unwashed skin, thick in the air as if someone was lying right beside him. He turned his head slowly toward the other bed. She was there. The woman was lying flat on her back in his roommate's bed. Her arms were straight at her sides, her eyes still rolled up toward the ceiling. The trembling was slower now but still there, a constant, small shake that made her whole body quiver. The sheet barely covered her legs. His roommate was gone, or maybe just not there anymore in the way he should have been. My dad's body locked up. He couldn't make himself move, couldn't even blink for a second. His mind told him to sit up, to run, to shout, but something about the stillness of the air and the quiet of the room made him afraid that any movement would break whatever this was into something worse. And then he looked away, just for a fraction of a second, toward the ceiling, and when he looked back, the bed was empty again. The sheet was rumpled the way it had been when his roommate was sleeping earlier. The smell was gone. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He stayed lying there, eyes wide open, staring at the wall until daylight started to creep through the curtains. In the morning, his roommate looked worn out, dark circles under his eyes. That's when my dad remembered the night before, the way the man had been sitting up with the light on, trembling. Later that day, he learned his roommate had experienced the same thing his first night there. The man had woken up to the smell, had seen a woman in the room, and had stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move or speak. The only explanation they could think of was the medication. Everyone on the trip had been taking anti-malarial drugs, and one of the possible side effects was vivid dreams or hallucinations. But even then, both of them had seen the same woman, smelled the same scent, felt the same fear. It was possible that exhaustion, heat, and the side effects all worked together to make their minds play tricks on them. But to this day, my dad says the thing that unsettled him most wasn't the image of her or the smell. It was that the experience was identical for both of them, down to the smallest detail. And no matter how much you tell yourself it was all in your head, that kind of coincidence doesn't leave you feeling safe. It stays in your mind, just under the surface, waiting for quiet moments to creep back in. It was the early 2000s, and I had just turned 18. I had gone abroad for work, not really knowing what to expect. I ended up in the Czech Republic, doing odd shifts at a small hotel high up in the mountains. The place felt like it was sitting on the edge of the world. The road that wound up to it was narrow and twisting, surrounded by thick forests on all sides. In the day, it was peaceful, with clean air and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. At night, it was something else entirely. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. I would lie in bed sometimes and listen to them, wondering just how close they were. The hotel itself was old but well kept. It had wooden beams across the ceilings, thick carpets that muffled footsteps, and a smell of polish and faint cigarette smoke that seemed to cling to the walls. It wasn't busy. Most days we'd see only a handful of guests, usually hikers or older couples who came to enjoy the quiet. Because it was so remote, the owners let me stay there as long as I worked. My room was on the second floor, small but comfortable, with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a view of the valley far below. At night, the town lights in the valley looked like a scatter of stars on the ground. There weren't many people working there, and I kept mostly to myself. But there was one person who always stood out, the maitre d'. He was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with skin that looked tanned like he spent time in the sun, and a pencil-thin mustache that seemed perfectly kept at all times. He dressed immaculately, always in a pressed suit, even when the dining room was nearly empty. His movements were deliberate, his voice calm, and his manners overly formal, almost like he was from another time. We had never spoken beyond the occasional polite nod. One night, after finishing my shift, I stayed in the restaurant. The place was nearly empty, just a few guests lingering over drinks. I sat at one of the side tables, slowly finishing a late meal. The room was dimly lit, warm, with the faint sound of wind pressing against the windows. I remember feeling tired but content, just taking in the quiet. That's when I noticed him walking toward me. His shoes made no sound on the carpet, and his expression was unreadable. He stopped by my table and, without any small talk, suggested we go for a walk. At night, in the woods. I didn't answer right away because I thought maybe I had misunderstood him. The idea seemed absurd. Outside the patio, there was nothing. No streetlights, no glow from nearby houses. The road down the mountain was pitch black until you reached the valley. In every direction beyond the edge of the building, there was just forest and darkness. I could imagine stepping off the patio and having the night swallow me whole. I said no, politely at first. He didn't seem offended. He simply repeated the suggestion, like maybe I hadn't really thought it through. I asked why. He said it was fun. That word stuck in my head. Fun. There was nothing about walking into pitch-black woods with a man I barely knew that sounded like fun. It sounded dangerous, but he didn't let it go. He said he knew the area well. His voice didn't rise, but there was a certain edge to the way he kept pressing, like it was important to him that I agree. Something in me tensed. I kept saying no, my voice getting firmer. He didn't argue, but he stayed there just long enough to make me feel the air between us turn heavy. Finally, he gave a small nod, turned, and walked away without another word. I sat there for a while longer, my appetite gone, watching the door he had gone through. The whole thing left me unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. I decided to head to my room. As I went upstairs, I noticed how quiet the hotel felt, like the walls themselves were listening. My room was cold, and I closed the curtains even though the window only looked out over the valley. I locked the door, something I didn't usually bother with. The wolves were howling again that night, their calls long and mournful, echoing off the hills. I lay in bed thinking about how dark those woods really were, how quickly a person could disappear into them. The next day, I didn't see him. I thought maybe he had taken the day off, or maybe I had simply missed him. But the day after that, he still wasn't there. And then another day passed, and another. No one mentioned him. It was as if he had never been there at all. The uniformed waiters and kitchen staff went about their work as usual. I didn't ask questions. The whole rest of my time there, I never saw him again. I don't know if he left, was fired, or simply vanished into some other job. Part of me wanted to believe he had been harmless, maybe just lonely. The hotel was isolated, with few guests coming through, and perhaps I was one of the only new faces in months. But the other part of me couldn't forget the strange persistence in his voice, the way he seemed almost desperate for me to agree. I finished my work there without incident. The days grew shorter, the air sharper, and the snow began to creep down the slopes. On my last weekend before heading back home, I took a trip into the city and visited the Staroperman Brewery. The atmosphere there was the complete opposite of the mountain hotel. Bright, bustling, full of people talking and laughing. I remember the warmth of the place, the smell of brewing beer, the golden light spilling across the wooden tables. It felt alive in a way the mountain never did at night. Even now, years later, I think about that evening in the restaurant. I think about the way his shadow fell across the table, the way the wind outside seemed to push against the walls while he stood there, waiting for me to say yes. And I think about how, in the darkness beyond that patio, there was no sound but the wolves and no light at all. I never found out what would have happened if I'd gone with him. I never wanted to. It was one of those school trips that didn't feel like a school trip at all. We weren't in some big hotel with neat hallways and key cards. Instead, the hotel was actually a bunch of small cabins scattered around a grassy, wooded area. The place felt tucked away from the rest of the world, like it could have been abandoned if you didn't know better. The cabins were old, mostly wood, with paint that had chipped in places and railings that creaked if you leaned on them. Each had its own porch or balcony, and a dim yellow bulb outside the door that barely pushed back the darkness at night. We had been there for a couple of days already, and the routine was simple: wake up, eat breakfast in the main lodge, go do whatever activity was planned, then have the evening to ourselves. That evening was quiet. At least it started quiet. I was in my cabin, which I shared with a couple of friends, but they were all out somewhere. I didn't think much of it. People were always wandering between cabins, visiting each other. I figured maybe they were down by the fire pit or hanging around near the main lodge. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I realized how empty it felt. Usually there was the sound of talking, laughter, doors opening and closing. But this time, nothing. The cabins around mine looked still, dark inside except for a couple with lights on, but no movement. I spotted one or two people here and there, just as confused as I was, wandering between the buildings like they were looking for someone. That's when I found out, from the way a couple of the others were moving around, that something was off. It turned out later that most of our classmates had made plans to walk together to a small convenience store down the road. Apparently, they had talked about it earlier in the day and the news had just skipped a bunch of us. I wasn't the only one left behind. There were maybe 6 or 7 of us in total who had no idea this had been planned. From our perspective, everyone had just disappeared at once. First, it was just weird. The kind of weird where you know it's probably nothing, but your brain starts making the silence heavier. We started moving around, trying to figure out where everyone went. A couple of people headed toward the main lodge to check if anyone was there. Others went toward the far cabins. I decided to head up to my own cabin because it had a balcony facing the open grassy area between the buildings. I figured maybe if I got up higher I could see something, maybe lights from the store in the distance or the group walking back. I went inside and climbed the small set of stairs to the balcony door. My hair was still damp from a shower earlier, so it hung long and flat, sticking in places, darker than usual. I had thrown on a plain white nightgown, one of those loose cotton ones that hung just past my knees. I slid open the balcony door and stepped out into the night air. The air was cool but still, and the smell of pine and wet grass drifted up from below. The light from inside my cabin spilled out through the open door behind me, washing over me from the back. I rested my hands on the wooden railing, the rough surface catching against my fingers. I scanned the open space. Down below, I spotted a small group, 3 or 4 of the others who had been left behind. They were walking slowly, looking around like they were searching for someone. Without thinking much about it, I lifted my hand and waved to them. Not a frantic wave, just a small motion to let them know I was up there. I figured they'd wave back or maybe shout something up to me, but they froze, completely. All of them stopped moving at once. One of them stepped back slightly, and I could see their heads tilt upward toward me. They didn't wave back. They didn't call out. They just stared for a few seconds before slowly turning and walking away, their pace picking up as they moved out of view. I stood there, confused. From my perspective, I was just waving at friends. But I didn't realize in that moment what I looked like from theirs. The way the balcony light hit me from behind must have turned me into just a shadowy outline. My long, damp hair was hanging forward, uneven and stringy looking. The white nightgown probably caught the light enough to glow against the darkness, and without my face visible in detail, I probably looked pale and blank. The whole scene, from below, must have looked like something out of a creepy movie. Someone standing alone on a balcony in the middle of a nearly deserted cabin area, backlit so their features were hidden, moving just enough to make it unsettling. I didn't know this at the time. I just stood there for another minute, looking out at the trees beyond the cabins, trying to spot any sign of where the others had gone. The darkness beyond the edge of the lights was thick, swallowing up the outlines of the forest. Every so often I thought I could hear distant footsteps or branches breaking, but it could have been anything. Animals, the wind, or maybe even the group walking back from the store. Eventually, I went back inside, sat on the bed, and started reading a book while I waited. Maybe 20 minutes later, the noise came back. Doors slamming, voices calling out. The sound of feet on the wooden walkways between cabins. The group had returned from the store, arms full of bags and snacks, talking and laughing like nothing strange had happened. I went outside to see who was around, and that's when I saw the same group I had waved at earlier. They looked at me strangely, and one of them asked, very carefully, if I had been standing on my balcony earlier. I said yes, wondering why they asked it like that, but they didn't explain. They just kind of nodded and walked off to join the others. Later, one of them told me what they saw. They said from below it hadn't looked like me. It had looked like something else. They swore the way I was standing and the way my hair hung down made it impossible to tell who I was. They said it was too quiet, too still, and the light made my outline glow in a way that made their skin crawl. For a few seconds, they thought they were seeing someone who shouldn't have been there. By the time they realized it was me, they were already walking away, trying to shake off the feeling. It became one of those little stories people would bring up every now and then, usually with a laugh. "Remember when you scared the hell out of us on the balcony?" they'd say. But for me, the memory stuck in a different way. I can still picture that moment from my side, looking down at them, waving, and getting no reaction but stillness. The quietness of the cabins, the dim light, the way the shadows clung to the edges of the trees. It was never meant to be scary, and there was nothing supernatural about it. But for those few minutes, we'd all been caught in a moment where the world didn't feel quite right. The kind of moment where the air feels heavy and your brain keeps telling you something is off, even if you can't point to what it is. And the strangest part is, if they hadn't told me later, I never would have known that I was the one who caused it. I would have just remembered that night as the one where everyone disappeared for a while, and I stood on a balcony looking out over the empty cabins, wondering where they went. But knowing what they saw, knowing how something as simple as lighting, wet hair, and a white nightgown could twist a moment into something unnerving, makes the memory sharper. I can see it now from their point of view too. The deserted cabins, the dim light, and the figure on the balcony who didn't move quite right, just standing there and watching.